Okay. Hey, Mirna. Good morning.
Good morning.
Well, hello. I'm here from Squirrel Space. Squirrel Space is a nonprofit, and I'm excited to share that we are still supporting NDers everywhere. Our goal is to create psychologically safe spaces at work, in public spaces, and in homes. And we do so by celebrating the diverse strengths of people who are neurodivergent. Our focus this month is on May mental health access. And with me is Myrna. I'm the CEO and founder of the company and excited to have Mirna here to really help us understand more than just awareness is accessing mental health at work, especially in the neurodivergent community, is very different than other experiences. And so, Mirna, I'm going to turn it over to you to share a little bit more about kind of what you have been sharing this month. And if you want to introduce yourself, and then we can go ahead and step into the presentation.
All right, that sounds great. Hi everyone. I'm Mirna Mejia. I have been a psychologist for over 20 years, and I'm also a certified professional coach. So, as part of May's Mental Health Access and Awareness Month, I have been doing a number of things, including today's presentation. But just a couple of days ago, I did a presentation on burnout recovery and how do we guide people to the right space, whether it's therapy, whether it's coaching, or really a combination of both. And I think today in this presentation, I'll say a little bit more about that when we talk about the mental health landscape that is certainly available to all of us, but we just don't know where to position ourselves with. And I also wanted to mention my role here in Squirrel Space. So I am the Chief Coaching and Culture Officer. So I'm always talking about how do we build teams embodying a coaching mindset, and then naturally that translates to how do we create and sustain psychologically safe workspaces.
Thank you, Mirna. And we'll be hearing a little bit more even next week from Rachel. She's going to even advance the topic on neurodivergent burnout. So I'm glad you mentioned that, Myrna. There's so much to cover here, and I know we don't have that much time. So I'm going to turn it over to you, and let's get started.
All right, so I'm going to share my screen and I might fumble around for a few moments, which is typical for me.
Totally,
Okay. All right. And can you see my screen?
I can.
Perfect. So let me, okay. All right. So today I wanted to talk a bit about performance enabling tools to ensure that there is mental health access even within our workspaces. So the main objectives of this presentation is to really reframe the language of accommodations so that we are utilizing a strengths-based and neuro-affirming perspective. I find that whenever we hear the word accommodations, I think a lot of people still have feelings about it, whether it's the individual themselves that is seeking and needing an accommodation, and also leaders. They have a particular mindset and sometimes a very biased perspective on what we mean when we hear the term accommodation. So I'm going to just reframe that a little bit to ensure that we're really talking about benefiting everyone in the workspace, not just anyone that happens to have a diagnosis. And then we're going to quickly review what is available to team members. So we're going to look at the mental health landscape, both informal tools that are readily accessible and free every single day. And then when do we really need to start considering more formal options like therapy, coaching, and FMLA, and so forth. For those of you that are watching this video, I want you to even pause for a second and take a look at this question and really reflect. Think of a time when one of your team members struggled. And what was your assumption? And the assumption doesn't necessarily need to be positive or negative, but it's just to have an awareness that there is always going to be an assumption. And I really want us to zoom out for a bit. When we think about assisting a team member, let's have it based on what they're actually needing and not primarily driven from what you think is going on with the employee. Right, so really take a moment, think of someone that you noticed was struggling and what was your assumption. And then one of the main themes that I'm going to keep referring back to is that not all performance issues are indeed performance issues. Sure, it might happen here and there, but I want to really have us view performance difficulties as data, as information. It's just what is the individual communicating with the observed quote unquote issue or problem? And it's not typically related to defiance or disengagement. So start asking the question, what is this behavior really communicating here?
I want to kind of press on this because this is a great point, Myrna. Seems to me, to be something where it's not necessarily a deficit, it could just be a difference, suggesting something deeper or underneath. And what I hear you say is to approach it with curiosity and to get
Right.
curious and wonder what's underneath there instead of labeling. Is that a fair way to, sort of like internalize what you're saying?
100%. Yeah. And you're going to hear the word curiosity pop up
Good.
frequently in the rest of this presentation for sure, right? Because if we approach these conversations with curiosity, then we are really co creating a plan with the employee, with the team member to ensure that they are performing at their utmost potential. So, yeah, a
That's
lot more
right.
to say about that for sure. And I always like to talk very quickly about just some important statistics. Given that this is Mental Health Awareness and Access Month, we're going to talk about very high level about diagnoses. And neurodivergence happens to be one of the most commonly diagnosed mental health diagnoses out there, right? So we're thinking about attention deficit, hyperactivity disorder, autism, and then, even though this isn't a formal diagnosis yet, there are plenty of individuals that really know that they have both ADHD and autism, and for short, we call it ADHD. But in general, roughly 1 in 5 individuals are considered neurodivergent. And I actually think that this is an underestimation. I want to propose that I say it's as common as 1 in 4, right? So it just depends on which data set we're looking at. Um, Roughly about half of neurodivergent employees have considered leaving or have left their workplace because they didn't feel that it was the best fit for them to thrive. And then there was also a lack of support. And at times, the intersection of being in really psychologically unsafe and toxic workplaces. I mean, just think of this number, like half of our neurodivergent population has considered leaving or have already left their workplace because of a lack of support. And then, as far as the workplace, what does this all translate to? Will this translate to money? It translates to money. Like it is very expensive to replace any team member, regardless of their specific role and title and so forth. And also, when we think about accommodations, which I'm going to reframe in a moment, a lot of these accommodations are absolutely free. So to me, it's a win-win if we make the time investment and have conversations with our team members. We can save team members from leaving. We're losing a lot of amazing talent, and then it's also cost effective for the organization to do a lot of this work in the very beginning to keep talent.
Right. So building in and being having flexible structures is easier
Mhm.
and less expensive than trying to get the people to flex to a certain system is also adjusting system and structures to support employee.
Yes,
Thanks, Mirna.
100%. 100%. So coming back to the question, think of a time when one of your team members struggled. What was your assumption? And really start reframing that as this is just information. And a lot of the information is that there is a misalignment, there is a poor fit between or mismatch between the individual, their unique needs and strengths and capabilities. There's a mismatch between that and the environment, and a lack of support available to them. So, again, it's not necessarily a performance issue, there's just a mismatch and a misalignment between environment and the available resources. So, one thing that I also want to stress is that a lot of managers, a lot of leaders, they get very nervous about anything mental health related. And so, always be clear you are not anyone's therapist, right? You don't need to be a physician. You don't have to have mental health credentials because you are not diagnosing anyone. You are just seeking to understand and be curious about what helps a team member, a direct report, thrive so that they can stay, right? So you only need to know what conditions help them function best and under what conditions is performance adversely impacted. So no diagnosis. You don't even have to ever say the word mental health diagnosis, and you certainly do not need to ask them if they do have a diagnosis because that is not legal to ask these specific questions here. Um, so yeah, I just wanted to say that because a lot of people get nervous, like, oh my God, what do I say? What do I ask? Like, you don't ask anything other than is the environment supporting you?
And Myrna, what should a manager do if their employee does disclose that they have a diagnosis? What is there a right reaction or way to respond, or how would you encourage a manager to respond in a neuro affirming and supportive way?
Yeah, I think just basic kindness is, thank you for trusting me with this information. And then shifting into the curious questions. What do you need here to best support you to thrive and do your job really well? Right. So it's not rocket science here. So you just say, thank you for trusting me with this information. And then let's have a conversation about how do we make things work, right? How do we make it more conducive for you to focus and so forth? It just depends what the individual is disclosing. So yeah, thank you, and let's talk. Let's co-create a condition here so that we can help you thrive.
Thanks for that advice.
And
That's perfect. Is stating,
mhm,
validating their experience, and thanking them for trusting you, and reaffirming confidentiality. And then, like you said, shifting to support. That all sounds like very neural affirming ways and creating psychological safety,
yeah,
allowing for that discussion to take place.
yeah, for sure, for sure. And so now I want to talk a little bit about reframing this language of accommodation, which tends to create a lot of feelings for many for a variety of reasons. So the old way, the old lens is that accommodations a lot of times are viewed as special treatment. The focus tends to be deficit focused, what's wrong with the individual. Then there's a lot of concern about the legalities of it. Like we just overcomplicate things when we hear the word accommodations. And then it tends to be focused on are we compliant with legal mandates like ADA and things like that. I mean, all of that is certainly important. However, that's really not the intention of accommodations, is really to enable performance, right? So I want us to perhaps reframe and use the language of as performance enabling tools, where it's really a much more strengths focus, right? Strengths perspective, and it's less about the individual specifically, but it's more about is this environment offering a variety of conditions in which all people, all brains can really optimally function here. Okay. So again, it's really about is the environment matching people's cognitive capabilities, what we inherently bring to the table. So accommodations is specific for people with a problem and a diagnosis, whereas performance enabling tools is really meant to focus on everyone. Like, is everyone, benefiting from an environment in which they can optimally perform? So it's a win-win rather than the company winning because these specific accommodations, but then the individual feels labeled, misunderstood, and so forth.
How does that impact, I mean, just kind of drawing on that psychology background, like with that language change, how could that really support or, help an employee's mental health by reframing? Because I hear you say the reframe, I hear moving from negative deficit language to strengths-based language. Can you help us understand how and why that actually affirms an individual?
Yeah, well, when you really think about if anything is deficit problem focused, I mean, just think about how does that make anyone feel, right? And so there's going to be feelings of shame, there might be sadness, there might be anxiety. I mean, it's just very, very heavy if the language is always framed around you have a problem and you need special circumstances, right? So now they feel outed, they feel like an outlier. And again, you don't need to have a diagnosis to just think about, well, how will that make anyone feel? How will that make you feel if that is what is continuously communicated towards you? And so just by shifting language, that alone can just normalize. It's a huge relief for people to say, "Oh, I get it. Everyone has a brain, right? And we all thrive, in our own unique ways. So we are really no different than anyone else. We all have a brain. We just need to understand what works with it and, what are the things that feel like we're always pushing against, like there's just resistance. And that is really applicable for everyone, not just a person that happens to have a diagnosis.
Yeah. So even being conscious and having people in the workplace switch to a strengths based language, that sounds like that alone could be a performance enhancing tool to use,
Right.
or formerly known as accommodation, is even just switching language and being mindful of language and how it affects people. It sounds like that is a good first step for many people to
Absolutely.
take in a workplace to become more supportive and helping people access the benefits is letting people know you understand and you see them. Thank you,
Yeah.
Mirna.
Yeah, correct, correct. And it's free, right?
And it's
Shifting
free.
language is free. It costs nothing. Um, And this slide here, is basically what I've been saying all along. Accommodations, again, the language is like, oh, it's only reserved for certain people. Performance enabling tools is really relevant for everyone. They benefit everyone, including the organization, right? Because if you have less turnover, right, then you're not spending as much money when you have a lot of people that are leaving because they feel that their environments are not the right fit and certainly not supportive of them.
Yeah, you're right. I
So,
mean, this is a great reframe into employers investing in a
mhm,
productive and healthy workforce and leaders. It takes an investment, which to me, again, using language, very different language than accommodation, as investment
mhm,
implies value, and employees have inherent value.
yeah, 100%. And so now switching gears, I wanted to provide some practical, like quick, not necessarily that they're always going to be easy to implement. Like some of these can take some time. But I wanted to provide some practical ideas on what these performance enabling, measures could look like. And I also wanted to call attention because even myself, as a psychologist and a coach, and doing this work with Squirrel Space, even I revert back to the old language. So, as you see here in this slide, I put accommodations where my intention was really to stay performance enabling tactics or strategies. So, really, just to highlight that to reframe language, it's an effort because we easily resort to the habitual way. So, I just wanted to put it out there because a lot of leaders and managers, right, they get nervous like, oh my God, if I say this word ever again, I'm a bad person. No, you're human, and it's going to take a while to really shift paradigms here until it becomes the habitual way of viewing all of this. So let's talk a little bit about some practical strategies here. So pacing, right? So pacing of activities, if this is feasible, does everything need to have a hard deadline? Or are there certain things in which we can have like a phased deadline approach, right? Perhaps at the end of this week, this is where we need to be as opposed to solely focusing on the end result here. And the reason why something like this is important because if we're just communicating the end result, the end result, the end result, I think naturally that can make just about anyone feel a lot of pressure, right? And then there might be some difficulty, some challenges, and like how do I prioritize? How do I organize myself if I'm just thinking about the end goal? So I do think that having these phased deadlines along the way could be helpful for just about anyone. Another thing that and this is under the pacing column here and also the presence, is many of the viewers might already be familiar with the concept of deep work by Cal Newport. And it's a wonderful book. It's a long book, but the short of it is that we all know when we are most cognitively present. Some of us is going to be first thing in the morning, some of us later in the day. Me, as an example, I'm 1 to 3. That's my peak, right? And then there's a quick, downfall, right? But
They
I
say
just
after 3 o'clock, I'm going downhill real fast.
That's right. That's right. And we kind of all know that, even though we don't necessarily talk about it. Um, and so, does the work environment support when we're at cognitive peak, right? And so, in some of the work settings that I've been at, they've been very good at saying, protect your time. Just put on your calendar that this is your focus time, and you put it in red or whatever color you want, and really instilling in the culture that if you see focus time in someone's calendar, that is off limits, right? Because you're interfering with someone's process and you're really disabling them from maximizing what they know is their highest peak potential and performance during the day. So don't do that. And I've also been in other workspace settings where they say protect your time, but yeah, meetings are still being scheduled, right? So it's just very incongruent with what they're communicating and what they're practicing. So all this to say is, yeah, encourage people to think about when do they know that they're at cognitive peak? Is it feasible for them to really protect that time so that they can do their deep work, right? To really dive into, important projects and things like that.
Hmm.
So I'm going to skip ahead, and you have this slide so that you can take a look at the other recommendations. Um, Further embedding these performance enabling tools on a regular basis. So during team meetings, are we sharing agendas in advance? Are we giving people the opportunity that benefit from kind of like a pre-summary? And then also important, is there an after summary as well? And I think a lot of times, especially with virtual meetings, now we have AI, which does a really beautiful job in summarizing like the high level and then, going into the transcript itself. And so that could really benefit everyone because think about when you have been in a meeting yourself, whether it's 45 minutes, sometimes 3 hours, right? Is anyone really able to capture everything in the moment? Number one, is everyone really able to remember absolutely everything after the meeting? Of course not. Of course not. And yet we have built this expectation that we're supposed to be present for everything and remember everything. And why are you asking me again? We just discussed this in a previous meeting, right? And so we really need to shift, how we're having meetings. So presented in short bits of information with agendas, summaries. Even during the meeting, are we pausing? Are we paraphrasing? I mean, all of that is very important and it doesn't take a long time. It takes 30 seconds to pause, or it might take 2 minutes to kind of review what did we just agree to do given this 20-minute discussion that we had before we move on to the next agenda item. And then I also wanted to say about performance reviews because I see a lot of opportunity for growth here, making sure that, well, first of all, that there is a continuous review throughout the year as opposed to holding all of this information for the annual review, really focusing on the specific metrics, the specific goals, with the assumption that the environment has provided the opportunity for people to work at their maximal potential here, right? So this is not about personality. It's not about, you're not a good team player or you could improve, being more engaged on a team, right? Because that may not necessarily be related to the actual goal, the actual project, the actual KPI, and, whatever metric language we're using. And I still see this as a big shortcoming in many performance reviews where we start intermingling comments about personality that have nothing to do, well, was the job actually done here? Another important thing that is often missed, it's a missed opportunity in performance review conversations, is actually having a conversation. You know,
Hmm.
given this report, what helped you, right? What helped you? What could have helped you along the way, right? And again, the assumption is that these conversations are already happening continuously, but a lot of times that doesn't happen. So let's say that didn't happen throughout the year. Now is the opportunity. What helped you? Under what conditions are you noticing that you're thriving, that you're
Hmm.
performing at peak performance? And what are you also noticing that wasn't helpful? Again, no judgment. This is just about aligning the person's potential with the environment so that they can continue to thrive here. So I'll pause since I just said a lot. Any comments or questions, Emily?
Yeah, I think these are great points. One question I have is how do you normalize employees giving feedback to their managers? Performance reviews have traditionally been very top down.
Yeah.
I review your performance. What about ways, because we talk about, managers doing a better job of listening, and we know that sharing information and sharing our needs can be very intimidating. What can managers do, Myrna, to create a more psychologically safe environment for employees to give feedback about their needs?
Yeah, that's a great question. And a lot of it has to do with the manager's own work, right?
Hmm.
Because if they find that they are avoiding soliciting and eliciting feedback, well, that's something that they have to take a look at. And coaching can be very, very beneficial in that respect. But if a manager is really interested, it's what they're modeling day to day by engaging team members with curiosity, asking them questions, really conveying that I really genuinely want you to do well and I want to understand. And I think modeling that along the way will help the employee feel comfortable in asking questions and offering feedback as well. I mean, it's a big question that you ask, and perhaps we could even have a webinar in the future on that topic alone, right?
Hmm.
Because you are correct, right? Not all leaders feel comfortable getting feedback, which is problematic. I mean, I'm just
Hmm.
going to bluntly state it. It's just problematic.
Yep.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah. I would reaffirm and agree with you that sounds like that is going to be a future webinar topic, as it does directly address some of the expectation of corporate culture, which
yeah.
is top down hierarchy. I tell you what's right, employee listens, employee executes, and if they don't, they get fired. That sounds like a very traditional model. So it sounds like different structures and
Yeah.
training is needed to create that mechanism. So, because managers don't have that training, and I remember being a first time manager, getting feedback can be scary. Knowing
Oh,
how
yeah.
to take feedback and how to respond, that's a skill. And it sounds like a future webinar topic.
Yeah, for sure. And as we're talking about this now, in my various leadership roles, I've never had formal training on this. I've had
Same.
plenty of training on how do you give feedback. How do you give feedback to someone that's struggling? How do you give feedback to someone that's not meeting expectations, right? But I don't recall ever getting any guidance, like formally on, well, how do you elicit? I think the extent of it is it's like you do your 360 evaluations and then these
Yep.
questionnaires, right, are just sent, and then that's the end of it. And then you read, but then there's no follow-up on, okay, what do you do, especially if you're having a lot of feelings as a manager, given the feedback that you've gotten. And so yeah, that's certainly another gap. So switching back to the slides again, a lot of this, we've already been talking about, right? Is like what isn't helpful for anyone, on the team is avoiding conversations when someone is not meeting, certain standards. Remember, a lot of the times it isn't a true performance issue, it's just a mismatch issue between the environment and what does the individual truly need. A lot of times leaders, they immediately jump to correcting performance. And some of this is when we start seeing, I'm going to start documenting, and then eventually you're going to be put on a performance improvement plan. And I think that model is all about someone is the problem. This is the plan to fix it. And if you don't meet these expectations, then you're going to be let go. So there's no curiosity here. There's no really like human, support here for the individual. And then what helps, what we've been talking about all along, observe, be curious, lean into conversations. The manager doesn't need to be the one to know what the team member needs. The team member knows what they need. They just need to feel safe in order to share their ideas and their perspective. And I think that what I just said leads into the next few slides about psychological safety, right? So again, reframing language. There's nothing wrong with the person. It's really understanding, well, what's going to help you and what doesn't help you, right? Because what doesn't help you is just as important as knowing what does help you. What's getting in the way right now, not why do you need that. And let me know if you're struggling. If you say that to someone, usually you're never going to hear a peep out of the person, right? It's really just normalizing. Look, everyone's brain works a little differently. So are you clear about what's supporting you? And if so, please communicate that with me because I'm going to do my very best to help provide those supports for you.
These seem
Mhm.
like great tools to be able to even onboard employee. Last month we talked about canary code, and
Yeah.
we talked about neuro inclusive environments and how to build for psychological safety.
Mhm.
And language matters. And also, I like that you shared that, when you're trying to understand a situation, if there's friction or if there's, a behavior that doesn't conform to
Mhm.
expectation, is to really try to understand. And so it seems to me that standardizing some of these questions into our processes, like into recruiting or onboarding or a new project, that sounds to me like a really nice system way to
Mhm.
enable managers, both neurotypical and neurodivergent, to know even what questions to ask. Because sometimes, from an employee perspective, it's because we haven't been asked these questions that sometimes employees don't actually know what they need.
Right.
And so, the more that we ask and the more that we practice knowing what we need and articulating our needs, that's very important because we need to reinforce this as habit so
Yeah.
that it doesn't build up. So thank you for sharing the language, not that, say this.
Yeah, yeah. And I think what you just said just naturally segues into this slide, right? We're just talking about psychological safety here. I think something else that you mentioned really reminds me of what I put here, modeling it yourself, right?
Yes.
So you can say things like, well, I know this about my brain, like my 1 to 3 o'clock, like that's when I'm peak, but that's when I'm going to schedule my focus time. I mean, just saying that, is modeling like, hey, I'm aware that I'm not going to be super laser focused the entire day because who was able to do that anyway? And I'm really going to protect the time when I know I'm going to be at peak performance. Just model it. You don't have to make it like this big deal. It's just matter of factly saying, hey, I just learned this about myself along the way, and this is how am I approaching it. And really keeping it about you and what you're observing about yourself, because what some people do is like, oh, I figured this out for me. And then they're going to prescribe it for other people, right? It's really about it's your brain. You know your brain best. You don't know anybody else's brain. They know what they need, right? So just wanted to also mention that as well. Um, I've said this before, right? Because there's a lot of feelings about anything related to mental health and neurodivergence and anything. But you know what? Health is health. You know, we in general are a lot more comfortable talking about physical health than mental health when all we really need to focus on is health, right? Everyone has health. Everyone has physical health and everyone has mental health. So health is health. And then you're not here to psychoanalyze or diagnose. You're no one's therapist. You are a condition creator, right? And this is through the conversations that you're having with your team members to co-create what is the best environment for them so that they can perform and thrive. It helps them and it helps the org, right? So it's a win-win. And then just have a few more slides. So everything that we've been talking about thus far is what could we do day to day at work? And the majority is absolutely free. It does take a little bit of initial time investment to have these conversations, especially in the onboarding process, right? Because we want these conversations to happen from the very beginning. Or if there's an organization that's kind of shifting so that they're embodying a much more like coaching mindset, yeah, it's going to be a time investment for sure, right? But in essence, it doesn't cost any money per se, right? What are some formal supports that someone might need, right? So there's EAP programs, and these are primarily therapy driven. They're short term, so they're not necessarily meant to do long term therapy, but it's really to help stabilize the person for symptom reduction so that they can either return to work or remain at work. There's coaching for individuals that don't need that level of care, like therapy. Again, often under an EAP model. But coaching really benefits everyone, especially as they're still trying to figure out, well, what types of tools do I really need? What types of environment and environmental cues would best work with my brain? You know, the person doesn't have to figure that out themselves. This is really when coaching can really come into play and benefit the individual. Um, and then FMLA, this is really when people are experiencing symptoms, right, that is interfering with many aspects of functioning. So this is not just an individual not doing well at work, but they're just not doing well across the board, right? So social relationships, family relationships are being impacted with whatever it is that they're working on. And here we can include things like burnout, right? So as a therapist, I put a lot of people on medical leave because in order for them to heal from burnout, especially working in psychologically unsafe spaces, they can't heal if they're still in a very unsafe environment. And so we absolutely need to do the stabilization. And then the individual has to consider knowing that I'm returning, right? How do I do that in a way that preserves me? Or do I need to start considering a different environment? And then that's when the individual can transition to coaching so that they can focus on what happens after I've done the healing from burnout. So FMLA here is not just a vacation, right? The expectation is that people are doing the work of healing and recovery, right? So that they can position themselves in the future to thrive, whether it's in the same setting or consider an alternative setting. Um,
Mirna, what oh,
yeah,
sorry, is there time for a question?
yeah.
On the kind of standard supports, how does FMLA fit with short-term or long-term disability or a leave of absence that's not FMLA driven? How do those work together, and would that apply to someone who's neurodivergent?
Well, I don't know all the legalities around leave and FMLA, right? Because it also depends on like state requirements. I know certain states there are additional forms. I mean, it unfortunately it gets very convoluted, which is unfortunate if a person is at the point that they're needing medical leave, they're pretty depleted. And then navigating different forms and different systems, it's already overwhelming. So I think the main thing that I will say is really, of course, seek HR, right? Guidance, that is what they're there for. You know, there is usually at least a person, or depending on the org, there could be an entire team just on benefits, right? So they are the specialists in helping the individual orient themselves. So it's especially important for HR to just be very compassionate, right, and non judgmental. And they really need to offer information in a paced way so that it can be processed by the individual that's already cognitively depleted. So I know I'm not answering the main question because it just depends on so many things here.
Hmm. So it sounds like it's something that is a case by case scenario, and that organizations work on being neuro affirming, that providing easier, clear access to these documents and clear guidelines on when to use each type of support
Yeah,
sounds like an opportunity space for workplaces.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, and also part of the question about neurodivergence itself, like how applicable is this for the neurodivergent community is very applicable. So tying in the canary code discussion that we've been having along the way, and in our last book club, you know, the canaries are the ones to really just know that there's something off in the environment, right? And so the neurodivergent population, their nervous system is quite adept at picking up the cues that are red flags, right? And so they really are going to be the front line in unfortunately getting burned out because of psychologically unsafe spaces. So, really, as I think about my therapy work, the majority of individuals that I've helped navigate paperwork and things like that, they are certainly neurodivergent themselves. Also, sometimes in our work, they haven't been diagnosed before, right? And it just becomes very, very obvious that part of what they've been trying to cope with is
Hmm.
not fully understanding how their brain has been functioning, and that the majority of environments they've been in just hasn't been a match for them. So, I
Hmm.
mean, it's just been very um, just eye-opening throughout the years that I've been doing this work and learning much more about burnout and psychological safety and the intersection with neurodiversity.
Hmm.
Um, So really the last couple of slides here, so just summarizing what are the core takeaways, right? Is normalizing that we all have a brain and that we have our own unique ways of functioning. So this is really about understanding what helps us be at our peak performance and what doesn't help us. And then as leaders, just being curious, asking questions, keeping your biases in check, acknowledging that we all have biases, right? But there is no place for biased, frameworks in conversations with our team members. I mean, that's just a no-brainer for me. We're not here to fix anyone, label, diagnose anyone. Again, it's really just co-creating. How do we help our team members thrive, perform well, so that the org also thrives and performs well? So they're not mutually exclusive here.
That's right.
Um, yeah, and again, saying the same thing. We don't have to have all the answers here. And then the last slide here, I'll just keep it open, is how do you contact us at Squirrel Space? So we're everywhere. So our website, LinkedIn, Instagram. We even have a YouTube channel, so you could easily find it. It's called Squirrel Space. There's no surprise there. Um, so any final questions or comments, Emily? And I'm gonna stop sharing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
just to close this up, thank you, Myrna. This was a really wonderful presentation to learn more about being neuroaffirming, which will help create access or easier access and more psychologically safe access to the resources and performance enabling tools that people with neurodivergent brains need to thrive in the same way that neurotypical employees thrive. So, this was a really, really powerful discussion that dovetails very well on what we heard from you earlier this week in knowing that there is a difference between coaching and therapy and articulating and knowing our needs and being able to advocate for them at work, fits really well into a coaching space. And as we start to train managers, giving them the same tools in the toolbox that a
Mhm.
coach has sounds like it's another opportunity space. And just to mention, we've got great speakers and presentations coming up that will continue on this topic. Next week on Wednesday or Tuesday, excuse me, we are going to be featuring Rachel Radway, who's going to talk more about neurodivergent burnout and talk specifically about how coaching with her or with a coach who specializes in ADHD or neurodiversity can be a very wonderful support system. And then at the end of this month, I'm very excited to share we have an in-person session with speaker who is triple certified as a prenatal educator and paid leave strategist is going to be with Rosa Park Neves. We're going to hear from her ADHD expert on paid leave strategies so that when preventive strategies are not working and if paid leave is needed, we will now hear from someone who has training and expertise in guiding employees through paid leave. This is something that we won't want to miss. And so we've got great content coming up that all lines up to mental health access. Thanks,
Wonderful.
Myrna.
Of course.